just to finish with bureaucracies, you should look at the Wilson text because that's actually a pretty good discussion of bureaucratic pathologies. What we talked about on Monday was it's probably inevitable that the size of the federal bureaucracy expand and keep pace with the demands for more government activity and intervention in the economy and social life. But even if you think that that's a good idea, and therefore in order to have a more active government and that does more functions, that you simply have to increase the size and scope of its administrative component. Nevertheless, like most political issues there's a downside to that. Aside from the concentration of power and the possibility that that more of American life will be controlled by unelected bureaucrats, which is what people are suspicious of anyway, there's the discussion of the 5 kinds of bureaucratic pathologies. And again, most of you are old enough and experienced with some form of government to have probably encountered one of these pathologies. Red tape, like having to fill out a form after a form or something like this. The complication and duplications of different offices having different overlapping functions. To be honest with you, I don't think compared to other countries in the world, American life is that bureaucratized. But if you go to a European country, and especially ones with a solid socialist tradition, in Israel, if you move to Israel or if you spend time in Israel, almost every day you encounter some requirement for a government signature for something. And since bureaucracy has to be complex, because that's its main claim, its complexity is what matches the need for expertise and pooled authority. Yet, Israelis regularly complain about the amount of paperwork that they have to fill out, the amount of control that the government has over the life, and the incessant necessity of constantly going back to some government office to have a form completed or stamped. So the idea of a duplication of effort, of red tape, of the getting sort of lost in the shuffle of complex offices. It's not just people complaining about how inconvenient life can be. Government really controls your life, and in some ways, the major claim that constitutional institutions such as the presidency and the Congress, as much as people criticize them, and I forgot to include these major criticisms in the last discussion, so we'll actually finish that up today. And then in terms of the judiciary, we'll start with the place of the judiciary in the Constitutional Convention, then we'll look at Federalist 78 by Hamilton, which is the primary reflective statement about the role of the judiciary in our constitutional system. And if Jack has enough energy, we'll also finish up today with Marbury v. Madison, the first major court case that not only involved the judiciary, but also involved the case about the judiciary, whether or not the court has the Congress. Whether or not the court has the authority, or the courts in our system in general, have the authority to declare the other acts of the branches of government unconstitutional. That was a unique power when it developed in the American world. Now almost every modern constitutional government has some kind of a constitutional court or a constitutional process, although no system in the world gives as much power to the judiciary in terms of the control over public policy and the question of constitutionalism. And that way, ours is still a rather unique system. So, if you look at the notes for today, there are 3 interesting criticisms made of the presidency. One conflicts with the other one. On the other hand, life is so complex that 2 contradictory things could still be true, but in different degrees. And then the last criticism sounds like it's directed at President Trump, but it isn't. It's directed about a general tendency in the modern presidency. So one criticism of the presidency is that the president is too strong. And, oh no, get under the table.
Why would you have done
No. It is Dr. Gunn.
Yes.
Is Terry still your mom?
Yes.
Holy crap, it's crazy. I love her.
So does Jack.
I love my mother.
I just had to pay $400, dude, for a fine.
For what?
They give you food?
No, I got food before that. That's why I took
We didn't bring enough for everybody.
No,
Wouldn't you pay $400?
$100 for. Something fine, you know what I'm talking about.
Well, that's pretty good food. You all eat at the college?
Unfortunately,
Residents?
yes, I live here.
Do you live on campus? So you're all living in the dorms?
No, I'm a commuter, so, but I do eat on campus, like with groups of people, like in between classes and stuff.
Yeah, but your mother makes you peanut butter sandwiches.
Oh, yes. Every morning, I wake up, she dresses me, tells me what
Spread
hours
with
we are.
love.
Yeah.
She'd probably choose it for you.
Hmm?
She'd probably choose it for you.
What?
Look, this is a full-service college. If you don't want to chew your peanut butter sandwiches, I'll chew your peanut
I
butter.
thought she said choose, he
As
said
in, like,
choose.
choose.
like-
Choose.
Choose. I
Choose.
thought
He
it
said
was
choice, and I was
Yeah.
like,
What?
huh?
I would chew your food for you. Would your mother chew your food for you?
It's like a mama bird.
That's so gross.
Yeah.
Your mother would chew a bird for you?
Probably.
Bless her heart.
Thanks.
Yeah, you have a reason to celebrate on Mother's Day.
She's a little crazy.
So, the most common criticism made of the presidency by a fair portion of the establishment is that the presidency has grown out of the structure of the Constitution and has become kind of an expanding imperial office, which threatens, and I have to say this is not an abstract or an impossible criticism because of probably in terms of most major modern constitutional democracies that have been overthrown and turned into dictatorships. The executive branch tends to be like, most of you probably have heard of Venezuela. I have good friends who are Venezuelans, and in the 1960s and 70s, Venezuela had one of the highest standards of living in South America. Now they're one of the poorest countries, and they have a refugee population of over 3 million. And the government looks as if it's kind of on the road down to Cuba. So on one level, the same with the Marcos dictatorship, and the same, for that matter, with Xi Jinping in China, although the changes in the Chinese constitution that have extended his office and expanded his powers, those are technically all ratified by the people's legislature. But in Russia, Putin has sort of ruthlessly expanded his powers, and there's not much check and balance in the Russian constitution. So it's true that modern constitutional republics do seem to be at peril through an uncontainable and ever-expanding executive power. And so people make that criticism of ours. But before we do that, why don't you make a hippopotamus noise and read the first paragraph about a caution about criticizing the presidency.
To be clear, it's a hippopotamus song. Major questions, criticism: too strong, too weak, too popular, a caution. Many people criticize the presidency when they don't like the occupant or the office or his or her
My
policies.
guess is you all encountered somebody between 2016 and 2020 who had negative opinions of President Trump.
Yes.
Yes.
Probably there are those who have negative opinions of President Biden.
I was in DC when he got elected.
Pardon me?
I was in DC when he got elected. It was crazy.
And it's
Washington,
just gotten worse. And you have to say, you could always criticize the occupant of the office, whether or not the person's doing a good job, or is inefficient, or naps too much. Actually, I don't think it's possible to nap too much. But you can't turn your dislike of the person in office into a principled criticism of the office, because then all you're doing is projecting partisanship on the presidency. That's not to say interestingly enough, for instance, when we come to the question of too powerful, both Trump and Biden have been accused of unconstitutionally asserting executive authority, which properly belongs to Congress. Interestingly enough, in both presidents, it's appropriate to end the course this way, because in both presidencies, the courts have intervened and limited presidential authority. One of the most controversial things that President Trump did at the beginning was the Muslim country travel bans. Do you remember what those were? Partially because of the threat of terrorism. After all, first of all, you should know that all terrorist threats in the United States don't simply come from foreign terrorists or even radicalized Islamic terrorists. What was the greatest act of domestic terrorism in the United States historically?
9/11.
That was technically foreign terrorists.
Are you talking about domestic terrorism?
Yeah.
The Boston.
Boston bombing.
Oh, only 2 people were killed, or 5 people.
Was it
were killed.
Park?
Don't you remember the,
Was it the casino?
no, that was,
That
it's kind of hard to make a distinction between simple murder and
there was
terrorism.
a, yeah, there
That
was
guy
a,
just holed himself up on the 33rd floor of a hotel where a concert was going on and just started shooting at people and killed 60 people. So that's terrorism, but that's not what we mean when we say terrorism. It's typically for political purposes. The, in 1994, the federal building in Oklahoma, Jim Blank and I just blanked on the guy's name, who they supposedly did this in response to the Clinton administration's shutting down of the Branch Davidian complex in Waco, Texas, which involved the deaths of over 100-some people in there because the federal agents surrounded the place and everyone was set on fire by the order of the Attorney General. And so, what's his face collected, the guy who organized the explosion, he collected about 219 pounds of nitrate fertilizer, which turns out is a powerful explosive, and parked it outside the federal building in Blank, Oklahoma, at the end of the day where the daycare center was. So among the 256 people killed were deliberately about 50 children. So that was actually our greatest and most destructive act of national terrorism. Now, so the reason that President Trump imposed a travel ban to Muslim countries is because their security protocols in terms of people coming to the United States are not particularly thorough or strict. So what happened to those travel bans? They were declared unconstitutional. And the Trump administration went through 3 different versions of them, in which they finally landed on 7 countries, 5 of whom were Muslim and 2 which were non-Muslim, which it was considered their travel restrictions weren't strict enough. Yet, President Biden also has issued several executive orders which the courts have found unconstitutional. In August of 2021, he presidentially extended, the CDC imposed rent and mortgage moratorium that had suspended people's rents for several months. Some people supported that. Some people in Congress encouraged him to do it. What was the problem with doing it? Well, he didn't have the legislative authority, and the court actually had ruled the CDC didn't have it. President Biden imposed the vaccine requirement for companies with 100 or more employees nationwide. The courts declared that was unconstitutional. This is something you might be interested in. Many people in Congress want Congress to pass a law which actually suspends and cancels accumulated student college debt. And President Biden has promised to do some version of extending, because during the COVID emergency, students were relieved of paying the interest on their debt and their payments. Now, that totaled evidently, I read a figure of about $150 billion of revenue, which is canceled. Because when you don't pay your debts back, somebody has to pay the debts. So if your student debt is canceled, the taxpayer will have to pick up the bill. Probably if President Biden does that, he will also, the courts will probably reject that as unconstitutional. So to go back with my original point here, how many of you would like to have your student debt canceled? Are you willing to have the president step outside the Constitution to do it? Well, all I can say is many people might support the action, but what if it involves long-range damage to our political institutions? Because I can assure you, the more that the presidency steps outside of legal authority and the constitutional form of government, every time that happens, you're setting a precedent for the expansion of presidential power. So everything has a cost and a benefit to it, sometimes complex costs. So go ahead and finish the paragraph.
One must always guard partisanship in wanting to change or overthrow institutional norms, because one's party may not always be in power. Harry Reid persuaded Democrats in the Senate to abandon the filibuster for judicial nominations. To the applause of Democrats,
This happened in 2013.
because it accelerated President Obama's judicial nominees through the Senate, and to the dismay of Democrats, because it enabled President Trump to accelerate his nominees during his term. The Republicans under Mitch McConnell, majority leader of the Senate before this January, now, because the party division of the Senate is 50-50, and Vice President Harris cast a tie-breaking vote, Chuck Schumer is now majority leader, did away with the filibuster in the Supreme Court appointments, which enabled President Trump to appoint 3 justices.
So, Bobby, I want you to know that the question of the filibuster applied to nominations has always been controversial. When the filibuster in the Senate first developed, it was only applied to legislation. That is to say, its only function within the Senate was to slow down or cancel legislation that was pending before the Senate as part of its legislative agenda. So some people applauded that. My only point here is that the same thing that the Democrats changed in 2013 to allow appointments without filibusters, that was fine until, of course, there was a non-democratic majority leader. Then the same procedures. So on one level, abandoning the filibuster in judicial appointments may or may not be a good thing, but you can't criticize, you can't make a partisan criticism of it. And the presidency of all the institutions of national government has the most personalized dimension of criticism because it's a one-person office. So you have to make that distinction between things the president does because you think he's too old, too feeble, too crazy, or the wrong party. You have to imagine, in other words, what the effect of the changes you're proposing would look like over the long run, which is what it means to think constitutionally. So, the first major criticism is the president too powerful. Are you too sick to read, Gracie? Taylor, would you read? Number 2, is the president too powerful?
Is the president unchecked right there?
Where it says Roman numeral 2 on the first page of the notes, is the president too powerful? In bold letters.
Okay, I see it. Has the crisis power of the presidency expanded the presidency to the point where the office is unchecked? What is the crisis power of the presidency? Lincoln gives a good example of this. During the Civil War, he suspended the writ of habeas corpus in order to detain people who might obstruct the war effort without benefit of civil trial.
Now, a little background. In Article 1, Section 9, it says one of the limitations on Congress's power is that the writ of habeas corpus cannot be suspended except in times of rebellion and insurrection. What is habeas corpus?
I heard that before.
Speedy and
It's a
fair
liberty.
trial.
Huh?
Speedy and fair trial.
It's related to that. It's the power of a judge who issues a writ of habeas corpus to any arresting authority on any level of government, by the way, which demands that the arresting authority bring the accused before the court and show just cause why he should be detained. Habeas corpus means you have the body, you have the person. And so that is an important check because it's one of the major checks against, when Russia invaded the war, when Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, it turned out the war was unpopular with some Russians. About 50 to 16,000 people protested the war in Russia. 5,000 of them the first day were arrested and put in jail. Now, Russia doesn't have a seriously independent judiciary, so there's no check on the president's power to do that in Russia. So those people languished in jail, and some of them are still there. With courts armed with the power of habeas corpus, that's a powerful protection for people. Because in effect, it means the judge is demanding that the policing or arresting authority release people or show just cause who should be arrested. So no kind of check or protection exists for that, for the Russian people. So it's not a trivial thing. Now, so in the Civil War in Indiana, Indiana was a northern state, it was pro-union, but there was a lot of Confederate support and opposition to the war. And one activist in particular, along with his followers, was arrested by the federal marshal in charge of Indiana and authorized by President Lincoln to arrest them and suspend the writ of habeas corpus. Now, it was controversial, and what's the controversy? What's the question? Let me ask you again, or tell you again, where is the constitutional power to suspend the writ of habeas corpus mentioned, and what are the circumstances that it requires for that writ to be suspended? It's Article 1, Section 9. What branch of government is that dealing with?
No, legislative, sorry, legislative.
So what were the criticisms of Lincoln's action?
Is it under his purview as president?
Correct. Exactly parallel to that we saw earlier with these other questions. So it's not that the Constitution says that in times of insurrection and rebellion, the writ of habeas corpus can't be suspended. It says it can, but who does it clearly apply as the authority to do that and should make the determination?
Legislature.
Congress should. So Abraham Lincoln was interesting. He wrote a letter to one of his critics that explained what he was doing. He said, first of all, the Constitution recognizes that there are times of emergency and crisis, like insurrection and rebellion, where the normal rule of law may break down. And he said, since it recognizes the possibility of suspending the writ, it's true, the implication is that the Congress has the power to do it and not I. But this is an emergency. And the necessity of shutting down support for the Confederate war effort in Indiana overrode people's civil liberties. So he argued it didn't break the Constitution. He argued he bended it, so to speak. Or that it was like cutting off a branch to save a tree. So he almost in principle admitted that he might not have had the constitutional authority to do it, but the saving of the constitutional system itself in this unique crisis justified stepping outside the Constitution. Now again, it's probably not a good thing to encourage the presidency continually to step outside the authority of the Constitution and do something simply by an emergency. That's what the crisis power of the presidency is. And there's no question that it is expanded through custom and to some degree through congressional authority. In 1972, Congress passed the National Emergency Act, which under certain conditions the president can make certain decrees and promulgations and even secure funding. Trump used that in the first years of his presidency to create funding for building the wall along the Mexican border on the grounds. So by the way, if I say I'm doing this because it's an emergency, what would you want to know if you were a citizen?
Who's it affecting and why how is it affecting?
Pardon?
Who is it affecting and how is it affecting me?
Well, there are such things as emergencies, aren't there?
Yeah.
And there are levels of emergency. I don't know what your political opinions of the border are, but it certainly looks from the news reports as if the border is in chaos. It's estimated that if the Biden administration lets the last requirement of sending people home because of COVID is lifted on the 22nd, that may lead to about 1 million people crossing the border illegally every month. So on one level, is that an emergency? Gracie, you suggested last week, how is that hurting anybody? Well, an emergency has to hurt somebody. So, but of course, what's the issue? Is it an emergency? Well, who said it was an emergency? President Trump did. Who gave him the authority to declare an emergency? There, it was a federal statute. So this whole question goes into asking whether or not we have gone too far in rendering the president's powers too flexible and have it sort of eroded the constitutional limits on them. By the way, I didn't ask you to read the reading where Nichols talks about that, but since you decided to read the rest of Nichols' reader over the summer, and I'll be glad to get autographed copies for you.
I have to return mine to Amazon.
Yeah, Amazon's already asking me.
Would you
I'm not
prefer to
trying
have
to
for the
pay,
rest of your
like-
life a signed copy of the Nichols reader
No.
next to your book? With my autograph?
No thanks.
I think I'll look at a piece of paper.
I definitely
Yeah.
hang that up.
I would too. I mean, don't your parents have some reason to be proud of you all? Wouldn't they be proud of you if they had an autographed copy by me next to your bed? Well, perhaps I'm just naive.
That's not bad. I would put it in a glass frame and I make sure I have like a pressure.
That's
weight.
correct.
Put it like up on my mantle.
I don't care what people say about you. I think you have a good idea sometimes. So, Aaron, please, Some would argue
Some would argue that the growth of the U.S. as a world power has so stretched the powers of the president that we are in continual crisis.
So, by the way, there are two questions. Has the president expanded the constitutional grant of authority? And here's what that really means in practice. Again, compared to, say, Putin or Xi Jinping, who have almost raised the level of executive authority in their systems to dictatorial power. The question, how do you know if an institution is too powerful or whatever? In some ways, it turns into the practical question, which you'll see in a second. Is the power of the president, has it evolved beyond the system of checks and balances? That's the practical question. So please continue.
Is the president unchecked? Many people believe that President Trump threatened the possibility of dictatorship. One can have intense policy differences with President Trump, even believe that he was unfit to occupy the presidency. Those who advocate abolition of the Electoral College or the two-party system should reflect that abolition of either would probably break down the final restraints on populist candidates and would probably elevate even more candidates like President Trump to the presidency.
Do you understand the basis of that speculation? We've just finished an extensive discussion of the Electoral College and the two-party system. And one of the functions that the two-party system has is if a person wants to get nominated to office, to run for office, to be eligible, it's not just that you have to meet the constitutional requirements of eligibility. Thank you. Ultimately, a party has to nominate you. So on one level, it's true, as we saw, that process of nomination has become more and more popular in its nature as we rely more upon primary elections. But still, the final step in the nomination for anybody who wants to be president is to be nominated by one of the major parties at their national convention. Now, what if we got rid of the Electoral College and the two parties declined to the point of either non-existence or lack of influence on the political system? How many presidential nominees or candidates would there likely be in every presidential election?
About
30, if not more.
I think it would probably settle down around 30 somewhere. And what would determine how a person would get nominated?
If they like put their name in a hat, basically.
Yeah, you could say, well, there'd be some kind of listing of national nominations, but basically anybody that, probably the model would be something like California's recall system. If you could get enough signatures of registered voters from the last election in California, I think it's 3%, you can be put on a ballot for nomination. Do you think there are enough billionaires in the United States who could probably afford the publicity of the campaign to nominate themselves and get a petition with their names on it?
Yes.
So in all likelihood, if you break down the last party restraints in terms of nomination or even an electoral college, you have to see that that pretty much opens the door to any charismatic or popular individual who has the finances and the administrative heft to get themselves nominated. So you'll see this criticism bleeds into the last criticism of the president being popular. Please continue.
I would agree with most presidents. Kevin Burns would too, I think. Nichols, number 48. Burns contrasts two views of the relationships of presidential power to the Constitution.
By the way, just back up in that one small paragraph, whatever that does contain an important point.
Whatever one thinks of President Trump, he would probably be the first to admit that his power was hardly unchecked, either by Congress or the courts. President Biden is likely to discover the same truth as have all presidents.
And indeed, President Biden has discovered that truth. Many of his major initiatives. Well, what was his major legislative and policy initiative?
Build Back Better.
What happened to it?
It got torn apart, but it still passed.
Well, who didn't pass it? No, it didn't pass.
Joe didn't pass, but it got close to it.
That was a major historical error. I know you were speaking enthusiastically, making those hippopotamus noises.
It's the Freudian slits, the intrusive thoughts. No, it was Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema.
So, well, it's true there were two senators, but the point was Congress didn't pass it. So on one level, is the president's power in check? How did Hitler deal with the fact that he didn't have enough constitutional support within the Reichstag? Well, he simply killed off several major opponents, outlawed all their political opposition, and very easily created a Nazi party majority. So on one level, it's clear our president's powers are checked and balanced in a way that other executive branches and constitutional systems are not. So this is the practical question, so please continue. I would agree with Mr. President.
I would agree with most presidents. Kevin Burns would too.
That's one of the issues in the Burns article from the Needles Reader.
Burns contrasts two views of the relationship of presidential power to the Constitution. The first by President Theodore
Roosevelt, by the way, I forgot his last name.
Roosevelt.
We're on first name terms.
Is often called the stewardship theory of the presidency. According to Roosevelt, the president derives his core power as the steward of the public good rather than grants of the power of the Constitution. This would suggest that by modern presidents, and so far as they allow this theory, really are not limited by the Constitution, but rather by what the people will approve of. Many scholars of the presidency, there's this in the Wilson's discussion of contemporary presidential power in Chapter 10, also support this theory, or did up to the Vietnam War. Many disapprove of it, such as Arthur
Schlesinger,
Jr., who in the imperial presidency came to believe that this led to the president becoming an emperor unrestrained by the constitutional system. William Howard Taft, president right after Theodore Roosevelt, and also Chief Justice after his term as president.
So by the way, William Howard Taft is the only individual to have presided over two branches of the national government. He was both the president after Teddy and before Woodrow Wilson, and was appointed to the Supreme Court by William Howard I can't believe I just blanked on President Blank's name. Harding. So he has served both as president and chief justice. So his view of the presidency is somewhat more limited than Roosevelt. So if you would continue.
William Howard Taft disagreed with Roosevelt that the president derived any power from the outside of the Constitution, but that the president's constitutional powers, when interpreted correctly and broadly, like Hamilton, were sufficient to allow the president to meet any national challenge or issue. This was also Lincoln's position.
So what's the two positions here? Roosevelt argued that if the president acted, not necessarily on the basis of some granted constitutional role or power, but if in his judgment he was doing it for the good of the people, that authorized the president to act. Now, again, I can put it to you personally. You could probably relieve by the time you graduate from this institution, which the tuition is what, like $2,000 a year?
What'd you say?
Got your attention. Is it about 20,000 now?
Tuition?
Somewhere's pretty. Yeah.
Well, that's room and board too. After you have to pay for that tuition.
Tuition itself is somewhere around there.
Right. So, I don't know, how much of the debt you're taking on for college is in the form of loans? So how much, in other words, will you guys typically graduate from here, the amount of loan debt that you've accumulated?
My first year is 9,000, but next year it'll be 10,000.
By the time you finish, you're looking at a Converse degree with about $80,000 to $100,000 in debt, is that right? Well, probably $50,000 to $60,000 in debt. The rest of you? You're not on athletic scholarships, right? Does that pay for everything?
No.
Well, okay. How many of you made the choice to come here? How many of you ever bought a car? How many of you ever bought a house, paid a mortgage? Most college students graduating, especially in more expensive institutions, probably end their college years about the equivalent of a mortgage of a house. Would you really agree to have your debt canceled?
I mean, if you just compared it to the mortgage of a house, if you come out with that, then you can like successfully start a life and like use what you would pay back for that, and like being
No, I
debt free
understand
so
the power
long.
of massive debt, by the way. And it clearly affects your life quality, doesn't it? Now, the point is, why should anyone pay your debt? I understand it has an impact on your life, but should people pay off your car?
Well, in certain situations, we can live in a society where we live in a society, I think you just said that, but where 9 times out of 10, the work that's done here is usually paid back through society in some way.
I don't understand that.
Well, like for example, I used my mom and dad's friend from college as an example. He went to law school. He's a criminal defense lawyer. He had over 138,000. He's paid all of his student loan debt or student loan debts back by himself. But he said that if his son, for example, wanted to go to law school and pay that back, he said by the time that his son gets to law, his son's probably 10 years younger than we are, but it'd be close to double that. And
What might say that again, sorry?
his tuition for law, or not tuition, but his student loans for law school would be close to probably double what he
Probably
paid.
true.
And he said, how are we going to be able to keep?
Well, here's one solution. Don't go to Congress College.
True.
Go to UNC upstate, or USC upstate. It's only $5,000 a year for tuition. So you chose to come to Congress College, didn't you?
But eventually, when everybody starts doing that, what will happen to people like you, who work at private
I'm
institutions?
dead.
Well, yeah, but by the time, like,
I understand the argument he's making. His becoming a lawyer benefited society. So if that's the case, why shouldn't society take some stock, some interest in preparing and educating people that are going to benefit it? But it's true. You could argue professions benefit society. But on the other hand, and I really don't want to prolong the question because I'm not really interested in the moral question of whether you deserve to have your college debt, but you could go to a cheaper college.
Yeah, you could.
So, I mean, if you buy a car, you don't have to get a Maserati. Although probably getting a Tesla is as expensive as a Maserati. I mean, any new car or used cars are overpriced at this point. But my point is, isn't your college debt a consumer choice on your part? So on one level, why should you be responsible for paying that? I understand you're young people who want to start out in life without a chain of debt around your necks. But in some ways, what about those people who paid off their college debt? Elizabeth Warren was a big advocate of this during the Democratic nomination, was actually stopped by a parent in Iowa in the caucuses because she had proclaimed that every college student's debt should be paid. And then a parent said, she stopped her during a television interview and said, I paid off my children's debt. And I didn't ask the government to subsidize me, so you're in essence saying I'm screwed. So on one level, isn't paying your college debt punishing people who pay off their debt conscientiously?
No. If people want, here's the example. I don't know if that debate took place. I don't know when the 2020 debate at point in time how old these kids were, but you got to think. Like my mom, for her freshman year of college, she paid $10,000.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, I have a feeling on campus the average student's paying around $26,000. I'm pretty sure that actually is.
For combination room and board, I think that's
Yeah,
probably
I
right.
think
In terms of loan debt.
Exactly, in loan debt. So in terms of people who have the money to pay, that's the other thing is Democrats, and this is one of the things that they've it's all about language and the way people word things, but one of the things that they've done is they've gone around and said, oh, cancel all student loan debt. All student loan debt might be interesting. It's really for people who have low incomes and this and that, but also there's the idea of just canceling it altogether.
In fact, the main beneficiaries of the cancellation that President Biden is talking about are those who have incomes $150,000 and above. So this is like a white middle class entitlement program. So again, I'm less interested in the moral question, actually, than in the question of whether the president has the constitutional authority to declare this on his own. That's really the issue I'm trying to lay in front of you. So is there an emergency here?
To some extent, yes.
What's the emergency?
Losing their homes.
I actually don't think most college students in their 40s, by the time they're paying off their debt, are actually, and the reason this, remember, was even extended in the first place was the idea that shutting down the economy for COVID probably put people in more precarious circumstances. There might have been something to that. So on one level, wouldn't you, I understand the relief it would bring to your personal lives to have $150,000 canceled, but is this an emergency that should expand the powers of the presidency?
I mean, for certain people, it could be an emergency.
That's true.
Because
But it's not that the president has the power to act for certain people. He acts in the name of the what?
The United States.
The whole nation. So, and again, remember, there's a long-range effect on the institution that may not be visible and shored up and et cetera. So again, if you're going to argue he should do this, probably the soundest base would be to try to find some legislative authority, or what would really be the best way constitutionally to do this.
Through the Congress.
Yeah, to have the Congress pass a law, because Congress has the power over commerce and lending, et cetera. So there is a constitutional method to do it, but what's the problem?
The president isn't going
Speed.
the constitutional way.
It's, again, like the Build Back Better program, there's not enough support in Congress for it. In other words, this would seem like there's a simple Republican-Democrat issue, but in reality, there are a good number of moderate Democrats who probably are not with the progressive wing of the party. So the problem is Congress can't pass this kind of debt relief. There's just not political support for it. So what people like AOC and Ilhan Orman, I'm sorry, just mangled her name, are proposing that President Biden do is overstep the congressional limitation and cancel it anyway. Well, at least what I'm trying to lay in front of you is the constitutional issue involved in that. So, Katie, I also believe, this is me speaking, that's why I use the pronoun I.
It is, I believe, also
You have to try to imitate my voice.
the correct reading of the president's.
I'm sorry, like Pee Wee Herman taking testosterone. Everybody should.
What?
Do you know who Pee Wee Herman is? Oh, it really is. Celebrity is genuinely trans. You really don't know who Pee Wee Herman is?
I know who Pee Wee Herman is.
The name rings a bell.
He
Rides
rides
a little
girl
bike.
watching movies
Gray
play
suit.
out. Huh?
He rides around in a little gray suit on his little bicycle
The
thing,
guy
and he
with the
sings songs and.
Yeah, I know.
Bit nice.
One of these days I'm gonna bring a thermostat in here, cause it has to be like 80 degrees.
You're a thermostat?
Yeah, cause I wanna see how hot this room actually gets.
You know, I was about to say something which is inappropriate, and a professor shouldn't say in the classroom. And probably I've struggled with that tendency all my life, is to say inappropriate things at the wrong time. So, I'll do it anyway. I was gonna suggest we all just take off our clothes. Now,
Quirky.
Be quirky. It'll be fun.
It'll be something.
It's so hot in here.
I don't think the AC's on in this.
Yeah,
It's
it's
not.
definitely not.
Tracy isn't even turned on, and I think that's the only unit that works over there.
It's definitely not.
I don't know.
I don't hear any machine noises.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
guarantee it's every day around it's like 10-degree temperature difference.
Go and meet the rest of you. A second inappropriate idea. So anyway, Katie, please.
Yeah, see,
The correct.
Oh, it smells like rotten flesh. Woo.
It might.
Oh, it does.
Do we have to see this?
Oh, just call it off.
You might not eat this.
What's that?
You might not eat this.
No, of course not.
The president's
Katie.
The president's power today. And moreover, presidents quickly discover that the constitutional separation of powers and checks and balances do erect formidable
Formidable, it's formidable. Powerful.
barriers to
Unbridled.
unbridled presidential discretion. The president is the most powerful executive in the world today, but she is not an emperor, empress, and the channel of popular responsibility through the electoral college, and the possibility of re-election or not, do force the president to explain and justify presidential policies to the people of the nation.
So I think from the very beginning, Hamilton especially advocated a powerful and independent executive, but Hamilton did not in fact expect presidential dictatorship as the ground of government in the United States. So I have to say, I understand his criticism, I understand who feeds it, and my response, and this is Bert's response, is that Hamilton's vision of a powerful but yet limited presidency is still a reality of our president and our system. I think that's true. That doesn't mean it'll always be the case, by the way. And it might be that the right emergency will come along, where all of a sudden the American people will give to their presidency the same kind of powers that destroyed the Weimar Republic and has subverted every popular government in history. Now, the second criticism is just the opposite. Not that the presidency is too strong, but that it's too weak. Well,
Is the presidency too weak? Is the job too big for any one person?
Yet some argue that the executive branch is so large that it cannot be supervised coherently. Again, in Wilson in Chapter 10 moves in this direction. Or that the Congress is so confused and enchained by special interests that the President cannot lead or govern or provide the kind of legislative leader that Kennedy advocates in his campaigns.
That's a reference to the four kinds of presidential leadership we discussed on Monday.
Or that the scope and demands of the presidency are too big for any one individual to manage coherently. As we have seen with Congress, the author suggests the necessity of revising the separation of powers. Some suggested a partial adoption of the presidential/prime minister system so that the president might control the internal workings of Congress more effectively, or that certain aspects of administration might be divided between a president and a prime minister.
So the question is what we expect the presidency too expansive for the actual powers and structure of the office? Do we ask for the presidency to do more than he can or she can constitutionally do? Again, I think the answer to this is the person who's sitting in the chair of the presidency. I think in some ways there was a sense in which FDR is regarded by historians and political scientists as one of the 5 greatest presidents. There was a certain sense in which FDR did not think that the challenge of executive government was too big for him. And one of the 2 major crises that President Roosevelt faced in his presidency. Depression and World War II. Pretty challenging. So in some ways, I'm less persuaded by this criticism, I understand it. And frankly, creating another bureau, another layer of bureaucracy in the executive branch to enable the president to control the executive, it's not going to work anyway. That will probably simply render presidential power more diffuse, even if it's bureaucratically expanded. And so read the last major criticism of the presidency.
4. Is the president too popular? We now have essentially a popular means of electing and nominating the president, where candidates in extensive binding primaries must now compete for popular followings to get elected. Caesar
Et al.
et al.
Et al. Is an academic abbreviation for et alia and the others. Because if you look at the Nichols Reader, this article is authored by 4 individuals: James Caesar, Jeff Toulis, and others. So et alia means and the other ones.
Et al. In The Rise of the Rhetorical Presidency argues that this, in combination with the growth of media, have made the president too dependent upon a popular following generated through constant cheerleading to govern. And it is very easy for popular opinion to chafe against constitutional limitations. Popularity is too transient.
What's transient?
Transient.
What does it mean when something is transient? Temporary.
They argue for a stable basis for government. And what about those instances where the president must go against popular opinion?
So let's stop for a minute. Is it good for the president to be unpopular? No. President Biden's approval rating, I think, generally is hovering around the low 40s right now. In some groups, interestingly, contrary to expectations, has plunged into the 20s and 30s. President Biden, interestingly enough, is remarkably unpopular among Hispanics. And so I think only about 28% of Hispanics approve. That's kind of a surprise because many Democrats thought that like being soft on the border, et cetera, would actually encourage Hispanic support. Why do many Hispanics not like President Biden? When do you think they might?
Demographics. I mean,
How do you mean?
a conservative. I mean, for example, I read an article back in November 2020, right after Biden lost Florida. It was a breakdown in Florida in general. It was talking about the Hispanic population from ages 38 to 65 are heavily conservative.
Although many of them are older Jews who tend not to be conservative. But that's interesting. There are 3 states that have become, I think, predominantly Hispanic. What are they? California, Texas, and Florida. And the point you are making is it turns out even if they came to this country illegally, many of them are actually traditional Catholics or very conservative in their social values. And so in some ways, I think it has kind of caught the Democratic establishment by surprise. So on one level, do you understand the question that's being articulated by these authors? Their premise is to run for president now, you essentially have to create, you have to appeal directly to popular opinion, because that's what gets you nominated. So was Trump good at that?
Not always.
Well, what was his professional background?
A reality producer.
Businessman and reality show and TV entertainer. So you could argue he had a kind of natural grasp on I mean, after all, can you persuade somebody to do something bad by making them feel good about themselves?
Yeah.
That's called flattery. And even at its worst, this tendency that they're talking about in this article is demagoguery. Now, Hitler, I just had a long discussion over the weekend with friends who had invited me to dinner. Yes, I still get invited to dinner.
Cute friends.
I know that's the amazing thing too. Well, it was not, so they weren't afraid of the reputation in the neighborhood. We were just, they're all Israelis. They turned to me and they said, "Do you think Hitler was a genius?" Do I think Hitler was a genius? Do you think Hitler was a genius?
Probably was.
He wasn't stupid. On the other hand, my guess is none of you have ever probably read Mein Kampf.
No.
700 pages of utter bullshit. It's not that it doesn't contain some wisdom, but Hitler's education never went above street pamphlets and political activism. He just absorbed the anti-Semitism of his day. And yet, this man did master German politics. He did conquer nearly all of the civilized world in Europe and Asia. He almost won World War II. So did he have talents? He had talents. I have to say, you would think that anybody with a freshman education could read Mein Kampf and realize this stuff is nonsense. So was he a genius? That I'm not sure about. Did he have political talents that enabled him to rise to power, to become a dictator? Yes, combined with a ruthless kind of willingness to use power, even murderously. And was he a military genius? He probably made some correct decisions, but in the end what destroyed him was he went against his general's advice and invaded Russia and led to the destruction of his own armies, etc. So he was probably talented. He probably had political instincts that helped him rise to power and he wield power. But the ability to generate popular support and get people to like you is not the same thing as governing. How many of you had parents?
Well,
They even chewed your peanut butter sandwiches.
they did.
But how many really think, I don't know if you, I don't want to ask the question whether you had good parents or bad parents. But could they have been good parents if all they did was to please what you wanted?
No.
They give you everything you wanted and whatever you asked for, sort of like Dudley Dursley in Harry Potter.
No.
Why not?
There's a difference between good parents and like raising a good person.
Also, like if your parents just give in and give you everything, that's not how like life
That's not
society
that's not
works.
parenting. That's
I
that's
would agree
addition.
with that. Children should be locked in cages in the basement. They should have their straw changed regularly and should have occasionally crackers brought down to them. But generally speaking, you can't raise children by teaching them that whatever they want is,
They look at because
because that's not how life works. It's also not even trying to teach people to be responsible for themselves. So actually indulging your kids' every wish is probably a way of undermining their character and probably turning them into obese diabetics. So on one level, you understand the distinction between being popular and governing effectively. And one of the things I hope you take away from this course is at the founding, the framers rather thoroughly examined the kinds of things that government needs to succeed and do well. Probably, I don't need to persuade you, but these were essays on the Senate and other aspects of the institutional founding. Isn't it a good thing, for instance, for the government to have some stability, competency,
Yes.
some grasp of the public good, which may be founded upon popular opinion, but can't be reduced? How many of you think that taking Nielsen ratings, which is how they estimate the popularity of television shows, Would that be the way? Why not simply submit every proposal for major action of the country to a YouTube thing? Why not simply govern by, because we have the computer power to do that now. Would it be good to simply base, well, you've already answered the question, I'm just doing obvious. So these authors argue the great dilemma with our presidency is we now force candidates for the president to become president simply by generating popularity for themselves. It's probably, could you all be persuaded that the way you have to run for an office has some effect on the way you use that office to govern in? So the people who wrote this article argue we all but require aspiring presidents to be masters of entertainment. And yet when they actually get into the office, it turns out sometimes you have to do things for a long range time. And what tends to happen to popularity? It fades, it's always transient. And to some degree, you might want, again, this is the whole premise of the constitutional system. You can have a broad and diffuse resting of a political system on people's opinions and popular opinion, but you can't govern that way. Ultimately, the premise of the Constitution is you can begin with popular opinion, but that's like some kind of raw energy or raw substance, and that what the representative institutions of government do is bring qualities that aren't present in simple popularity. But if we're forcing the presidency to run and govern through more and more popular, and this is why they use the expression cheerleading. Now again, probably most of you don't personally hold President Biden responsible for the inflation that has now reached an annual rate of 11% since January. Is that having an effect on you?
Yes.
I was trying to make a point in my Politics of Doom class that I'm a critic of much of, as I've already mentioned to you, and I will send an article out at the end of the class, which is taken from one of the books I'm using in my Politics of Doom class. I'm a critic of environmental apocalypse and environmental alarmism. Having said that, it's probably true that that the inflation, the reason I discussed this in class was one critic of environmental, again, I asked you this before, how many of you think that the Earth is going to be destroyed by the end of the century through climate collapse? Most of you said this a few weeks ago that you thought the planet was doomed. Do you really believe that? That your children and grandchildren are doomed. Do you really believe that? Yeah, how many of you think there's an impending mass extinction because of climate change and collapse? You know who Greta Thunberg is, don't you? That Swedish teenager that got before the UN. And what's her famous phrase? How dare you? Don't you remember this? She's saying to the world leaders and anyone over the age of 15, how dare you ruin my future? All right. It may or may not be true whether your future is, but one of the authors I use in class estimates that a scientific projection of climate change by the end of the century suggests that the real difference would be a growth rate for the globe of a loss of about 2% growth rate by 2100. What that would be the equivalent of in your personal lives is what inflation has taken away from your lives. Actually, a little less than that in the last few months. We've all had to pay higher prices for things, right? Has that ended your comfortable life? Has the quality of your life, this is what I'm asking you, has the quality of your life changed dramatically from when inflation seriously began last year? Has it deprived you of the ability to live your life? Has it thrown you into poverty? Another mistake I made, of course, was asking that question in class because the student tomorrow said, yes, I've been thrown into poverty. So, you know, but having your dollar only pay or not be able to pay for about 7% of what you could ingest, does that mean that you've been thrown into poverty? So, I mean, on one level, you could say this. The inflation we're experiencing right now is affecting our lives, obviously. But is President Biden responsible for that inflation? I think you could make an argument for and against, or for and against some of it. But clearly, you could say this. No presidency is reducible to a single issue. And the truth of the matter is that the long-range effects of inflation may not be controllable by the president. Yet, on one level, what has President Biden been doing ever since the inflation began?
Blaming out food.
Blaming it on other people,
Blaming
including Putin. There's something to that, of course. So my point here is this: if you're a president, I think you got the point. If you're a parent, you have to make hard decisions that may be unpopular with children, and yet sometimes you have to override their judgment. Sometimes the president, and Hamilton anticipated this, may have to make an unpopular decision for the good of the nation. And yet, if his presidential power rises and falls with the popularity of his person, that would suggest that in critical times, when the president has to fall back on constitutional authority, he won't be able to do it because the way that you get your policies accomplished is by sustaining your popularity. But again, I don't think even modern media have the power to do that.
So would you agree with the statement? I read an article about 3 weeks ago talking about the assertion that this is keeping presidents aside, just mainly talking about people in positions of power that have been in for long periods of time. So some of the least popular people in power are the most effective people.
Give an example.
So, for example, Nancy Pelosi was used in that. Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell were put in that article at various times.
True. Congressional leadership tends to be based on seniority. So if you come from electorally safe districts, like Nancy Pelosi, what's her home district?
Like the San Francisco.
Right, first Baltimore, and then she moved to San Francisco, a reliably liberal and progressive area. So it's true, and then most of the leadership in Congress right now comes from those areas. Steny Hoyer comes from New York, etc. And so on one level, they have been serving in office for, in fact, they tend to be the longest people serving in office. So there's no question that they're powerful, and there's no question that they are consequential. Are they some of the most powerful people in our system?
They are, but
So, by the way, does that suggest that there should actually be more temporariness in office?
that was the assertion of the article, is that as they've gotten, as I said, but really the whole point of the article was discussing that the most popular are the most capable in terms of their usage of their own office. So
It's true,
it's
and what makes them powerful, by the way, is two things, ironically contradictory. One is, as I said earlier, they're actually electorally secure. They come from parts of the country where it is not unlikely, for instance, that Nancy Pelosi will ever face a serious Republican challenger from San Francisco. Yet, what gives them their power is in some ways that they have positions within the constitutional system that, I was going to say, are beyond popular control. So what makes them powerful is that their position of authority isn't subject to shifts in popular opinion. But it is, because in 1992, the Speaker of the House, whom I'm blanking on right now, had been one of the most powerful individuals. He'd been Speaker a long time, wasn't Tip O'Neill, and he was actually defeated in some district. So even though those people have power, they are not actually beyond popular control. Now the question is here's an idea. Should the president be subject to being dismissed from office when his popularity falls below 40%? How about that as a measure?
because it's so, income is so.
Well, whatever you think of Bump and Dryden, Trump and Biden, it's not clear that shortening their tenure in office would solve the problem. So on one level, this culminates in rather a grave issue, the popularity of the presidency. Put your notes away.
Yeah.
How can I ask you to read if the notes aren't in front of you?
Well, you're saying it's
There must be a reason.
1 minute left.
It's only
40 seconds left.
3:43. Oh, no, 3:43.
It's actually 3:44.
And
It's one.
according to whatever time we're all.
Why did you set your watches early?
I didn't.
No, we didn't.
You said yours behind a minute.
Because we don't have a set one, they're set automatically, so all of ours
I'll
are
just
set.
finish reading it myself. So where does this go? And not just the weakness of the presidency, but rather to endangering the constitutional system by the presidency. Can the president become a primary threat to the Constitution? Lincoln suggests this is possible, but the president must always be his power attached to the Constitution, which is why he made a constitutional argument for it. The framers wanted to connect the presidency to public opinion. but not too directly or too constantly, not only because that might encourage cynicism through public opinion, when government can't meet the expectations of popular rhetoric and cheerleading, but could either deprive the president of the power to act unpopularly, or even worse, to begin to pit popular support against the limits of the Constitution. Hitler would say, by the way, it wasn't he who overthrew the Weimar Constitution in 1933. The people of Germany overthrew it in choosing him. So, in the hand of talented demagogues, they could encourage the people to prefer dictatorship over presidential constitutional leadership. This has been the route that most constitutional republics have taken on the board to destruction. This danger is not only a possibility in our Constitution, even though it has endured for many centuries. We'll see you on Monday.